Games are violent because it's easy to gamify two forces using everything at their disposal to compete over mutually exclusive win states. But trying to turn debate into code is basically a vain attempt to digitize the human brain. There are so many complicated emotions that fuel a worldview, and there are so many different approaches to try and influence that perspective that it seems laughably reductive to try and turn that into a bunch of button prompts. With that said, getting people to change their mind is pretty much the human experience, much more than fistfights are nowadays, so we can't completely ignore it in our art. How can the interactive medium make interesting arguments that aren't just cutscenes? How can these debates be as fun as a typical scrap? And what makes for an interesting argument in the first place? This video contains sizable story spoilers for these games. It'll hurt first-time runs to know what's coming ahead of time, so I recommend tackling those first if you're already interested in them. But if not, maybe I'll convince you to check them out after. The most immediate way to make an interesting argument in the medium is to turn the argument into a fight, by making the fight into an argument. Not exactly what we're talking about here, but a good transition. Take MGR's final fight with Senator Armstrong, who believes that might makes right, and wants to turn America into an even more hostile, militaristic, fascist, anarchistic dystopia. At first, being an early 2010s game, he seems like a ridiculous parody of American policymakers and Metal Gear villains in general, but he's being honest about what he believes. To convince him he's wrong, you need to beat him in a video game boss battle, winning the physical fight and the logical, if silly, argument. What makes this clash interesting isn't just the spectacle, but it's the way that each character manages to change the other's mind. Raiden starts out fighting to protect the status quo and war economy, but while he wins the might makes right fight, he ends up following in Armstrong's footsteps, fighting outside the law against the world. Armstrong's goal was to use a war to change the US, but he died content with Raiden's more cautious approach. Even Blade Wolf starts out as just a thinking robot, but ends up making his own directives to fight for himself. The reason I bring this moment up is that even though the arguments are all pretty silly, it makes for good TV, since you get to see each character's worldview change and grow. Unfortunately, it's just good TV at the end of the day. While the player gets to feel the ups and downs of the argument emotionally, mechanically all they're doing is playing the video game. They aren't making any arguments for themselves, they're just Raiden with Raiden. How can we allow the player to speak their own mind and engage with the game world with their own arguments and diplomacy? There are games out there with a speech stat where you level a character's ability to wordsmith, but just as leveling up strength doesn't make the player better at the game's combat, neither does this. New Vegas proves this point, since your ability to schmooze is directly determined by one of your stats. Not only does it lead to frustrating moments when you get to a needless conflict that the game says you just aren't smart enough to get out of, but it also takes away video game when you are leveled properly. This is best illustrated in the last mission, where you can effectively skip the final boss fight by talking them down. If your speech stat isn't maxed, then you feel like a failure for resorting to violence, but if you solve things peacefully, then the game ends pretty flat. You just click on a conflict solve button and your antagonist walks off. It's well written, but it's not necessarily well designed. I much prefer the encounter with Benny, where you can use your speech stat to isolate him from his bodyguards, changing but not erasing the fight. The ability to level speech here is just a number you either have or you don't, and given how often it shows up, you're obviously going to pump it whenever you can. There's very little strategy to it. A better design pattern is to make the player actually pick out the best dialogue option. Usually this approach is used to interview a character so the player can get some world building, but it's possible to turn this into a game of chess too. The most famous example is Mass Effect, which has you dealing with precarious diplomatic missions, but I've never fallen in love with that series because there's really only 3 dialogue choices at most at any time. You can play a Paragon who always chooses the highest option available on the wheel, which will lead to an agreeable solution that everyone can get behind. You can play a Renegade, which is more selfish but just as effective, or you can mix and match, which risks worse results in exchange for fun. Unfortunately, playing a character in this game is non-optimal strategy-wise, so it gets the worst aspects of playing a character you might disagree with and an avatar you're just projecting onto. Shepard isn't really an interesting perspective in and of themselves or a suitable host for the player's worldview, so they lose out on having any kind of voice at all. I'd argue that the exception here proves the rule though. Since you know there's an optimal strategy to getting what you want, you can tell that negotiation can be broken down into the same rigid kind of rules that something like combat can. A better example comes out of Deus Ex Human Revolution. Throughout the game, you run into a number of dialogue challenges where you need to reason with a person to progress. It's very important that you convince them to do what you want, because otherwise you're forced into much more difficult scenarios. Take for example the encounter with Wayne Haas. Some backstory. This guy and your player character Adam used to be on SWAT together, until you refused an unjust order to kill a robotically enhanced 15-year-old. Since Adam disobeyed orders, it fell to Wayne, and now he's stricken with grief. Now you're private security, and he's stuck on the front desk of a police station. Due to an elaborate Illuminati conspiracy, you need to get access to the station's morgue. But to get there, you need to get through Wayne, who will certainly lose his job if he decides to help you. Without his help, you'll have to murder stealth your way through a bunch of police officers. Like Mass Effect, there are multiple ways of reasoning with him, though they aren't spelled out for you quite the same, and if you can navigate the dialogue tree carefully enough, he'll let you pass. His responses are also slightly randomized, so you'll need to listen to what he has to say for each run. But what I really like about it is the social upgrade you can buy in the skill tree. If you want to guarantee success from each social boss fight, you can purchase the social enhancer for unique dialogue options. The catch is that it doesn't net you the best ending here. Without the upgrade, you'd navigate through the dialogue tree and help Wayne deal with his guilt. Later on in the game, he'd show back up upset that you, in his eyes, cost him his job, screwing him over for the second time. You'd apologize and offer him a new job working with your company, and everyone lives happily ever after. But if you use the social augment, instead of helping him out, Adam will point out some contraband painkillers hidden in the background, blackmailing Wayne and forcing him to let you through. It's a guaranteed win, but later in the game when he confronts you, he'd instead turn hostile. He's not much of a threat, so he's easily taken out, but that almost makes it worse. He's an incredibly tragic character, and having the player kick him while he's down is an incredibly cool way to show that your protag is losing their humanity with an increased reliance on technology. An interesting conversation is one where character takes center stage. A discussion can put the player in the pilot seat, and speech can be just as strategic as any old-fashioned tussle. It can be a bit rough when a game makes you pick between talking it out and throwing hands, and it's always going to be a bit reductive to narrow down human communication into a few optional lines. But when two characters can come to even a modicum of an understanding, then the message could become clearer.